Hi everyone, I hope everything's going well. For this week we're in Module 2. Module 2 is going to be focused on reading Chapter 3, and you're going to have quiz number 1, which is going to be 20 questions, 1 attempt. You're going to have 60 minutes to complete the quiz, and no resets are allowed. So when you start the quiz, you have to complete it at that point. Even though it will say you can start and resume the test later, the test will keep running. So make sure, even if something occurs that you try to get out of it, come right back to it. Okay? In Chapter 3, we're going to be looking at supply and demand. When you look at supply and demand is considered very basic. And very basic because it applies to everyone in this class. And a lot of people don't realize how important supply and demand is, but it's the basis for how prices are determined. Supply is the amount of something such as a product or service that a market has available. Demand is the amount of the product or service that buyers want to purchase. So supply deals with sellers, demand deals with buyers. The relationship between supply and demand has a good deal of influence on the price of goods and services. Now, understanding the law of demand is an important part of deciphering the relationship between supply and demand. According to the law of demand, price has significant effect on demand. So as prices increase, you'll notice, just like with me or you, people will buy less. Essentially, higher prices translate into less demand for a product or service. When the price of an item or service is high, an individual must consider that buying that item may prevent him from being able to afford the purchase of another, more valuable item. The law of supply is vital to the understanding the relationship between supply and demand. According to the law of supply, higher quantities of a product or service are supplied at higher price points. Those who produce goods or offer services are willing to supply more at higher prices because selling there at higher prices increase revenue. I want to sell more at a higher price if I was a seller. The supply and demand relationship affect price in a different manner. When a company has produced too much of an item, for example, if the gift company increases production to create 500 gift items, but demand stays at 200, you notice there's a big surplus right there. So what happens if we have a surplus? The firm might have to reduce product or the price just to maintain for that level. It is possible for supply and demand to be equal. In order for this to happen, the amount of supply must equal the amount people want. So it's going to be an interesting back and forth of what are we going to do to focus on here? What are people going to actually want? Okay? Now, you're going to find your quiz listed in the assignment section. Now, here are some types of questions that you might see with your quiz. I'm not saying these are the exact types of questions, but here are some of the types of questions that you might see. You might see a decrease in quantity demanded. That's represented by a movement along the demand curve, which is brought about by a price. You might see a graph looking at the price floor. And what is price floor looking at? If I showed you a price floor, where would the government have to get involved? Question 3, I might give you a graph to notice where is the surplus, where's the shortage on the graph. Another question could be relating finding equilibrium price and quantity. Another question is focused on the determinants of supply and demand, input prices. So if there's higher input prices, that means that the supply would decrease. Another question is looking at the market equilibrium. Another question is looking at what a market is, and a market is where a buyer and seller come together to transact. Another question looks at a normal good. Another question looks at why would a supply curve shift to the left? What would be a major reason why the supply curve would shift? Another question would be looking at why would, if a government gives a subsidy, what would happen to supply if there was a subsidy involved? Another question looks at what is a price ceiling and what is a price floor. So what does it look like on a graph? A price floor is if the equilibrium price is here, it means you can never go below the floor. So if the floor level is here, the equilibrium price is lower than that. That's a price floor. You can never sell a price below the floor level. Another question is looking at a product market. A product market's where demand and supply intersect. Another question is looking at shifts in supply. Another question is on inferior good, what an inferior good is. What is the equilibrium price? What's that illustrating? The market demand curves, another question. If there was a surplus in the market. And the relationship of the law of demand. That's another question that we could be focused on as well. So those are some questions that you might see. Now, it's going to be, a lot of students are going to get random questions, so that those are exactly the questions, but they're very similar to what you might see. And if you have any questions, let me know, but I look forward to your effort this week.